It took me a very long time to become comfortable with mixing my own produced tracks. Now, I am a professional musician, classically trained, but when it comes to the audio engineering side of things, I definitely graduated from YouTube University. Now, YouTube is a great resource for free information, but the problem with free information is most of the time you get what you pay for. So I've compiled 5 pieces of advice that I received from YouTube over the years that I feel held me back from becoming a good mix engineer. Now, not everything on this list is bad advice in and of itself. However, as an uneducated producer and mixer, I took all these techniques I was learning from YouTube and I believed that these were things you had to do all the time in order to become a good mix engineer. In reality, these techniques are things you do when you need to. The issue was because I was so uneducated and so new to this, I didn't have a trained ear and I didn't know when or why to do these things. A lot of the videos that I've watched and that I still see are videos that will tell you how to do something, but they don't tell you why or when you should do it. So, here are 5 pieces of bad advice I received that held me back from becoming a good mix engineer. Number 5, roll off everything below however many hertz. You've probably seen it in a million YouTube videos. Someone will tell you to EQ or filter out everything below X amount of hertz. Now, while rolling off the low end of most of your instruments to make room for the kick and bass can be a good technique, it can also hurt your mix. It really depends on what's going on in your song. This piece of advice had me rolling off everything that wasn't kick and bass by a lot. It led to a history of incredibly weak sounding leads, crappy snares, and hollow tinny vocals. I've seen some people say to roll off anything below 120 hertz. And maybe it works for them and the type of music that they make, but it could be the thing keeping you from achieving a full sounding mix. So next time you're rolling off the low end of an element in your song that isn't the kick or the bass, really listen and hear how it affects the sound. If it's making your lead sound worse, then maybe you need to find a different lead, maybe you need to move it up an octave, but just indiscriminately cutting the low end off of your lead sound could make it sound terrible. Number 4, sweep for and remove all of your resonant frequencies. So yes, I am guilty of making a video about sweeping for resonant frequencies. Now, I haven't watched it in a while, but I should have included some sort of disclaimer, and if not, I'm gonna go ahead and do it now. You don't need to sweep for resonant frequencies in every instrument, and you definitely don't need to search for multiple ones within instruments. Resonant frequencies occur naturally, and suppressing them should be done only when it needs to be. So when you can hear some irritating frequency sticking out of your mix, go ahead and suppress it and then just be done with it. If you start sweeping with soloed bands on soloed instruments, you're gonna find resonance everywhere because it occurs naturally. And resonance can be really important to the character of the sounds you choose. And if you overdo it, well, the sounds you choose can end up sounding very dull, which will lead to a dull sounding mix. Those are the mixes that I used to have an issue with because everything I did had resonances suppressed to the point where the instruments didn't sound exciting anymore. Number 3, always keep your bass in mono. Again, this alone is not bad advice, although I would rephrase it to always keep your sub in mono. Keeping your bass in mono is great for certain genres, but what about the more bassy subgenres of house and techno music? I used to roll the sides, the stereo, off of my mix all the way up to 120 hertz, and then I was wondering why none of my songs sounded as cool as songs by people like Matroda or Martin Eichen. Then one day I pulled one of their tracks into Ableton to reference it. I threw a mid-side EQ on there, set it to side, and looked at the stereo image using the Ozone Imager, and there was width way down, all the way down to almost 60 hertz. It was pretty wide. But if I had listened to everything that I saw on YouTube, I would still be rolling off all of the width up to 120 hertz and wondering why I didn't have that big fat low end. So make sure to always A/B test. If it sounds better rolled off to 120 hertz, then go ahead and do it. But if you want to test out and see if you can make your low end really wide and it still sounds good and holds up on big speaker systems, then by all means, do what sounds good. Number 2, compress, compress, compress. Compression is one of the most difficult things for beginners to understand about mixing. This leads to it being a hugely popular topic on platforms like YouTube. Compression is everywhere. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of videos about compression. So it must be super important to compress everything all the time, right? No. In my experience, most of the producers I've met are using drum samples and other samples from places like Splice, where these are professionals who create these samples, and they're already pre-processing them to have good, steady dynamics. So if you're getting your kick drum samples from a reputable sample distributor and a reputable company, and you pull it into your mix and you don't like the way it sounds, don't just try to compress and EQ the hell out of it. Just find a different sample. These are already kind of created to be the best they can be. Now, if you're recording your own samples or your own vocals, then yes, you will need to compress. And you will want to compress usually at the group and mix bus levels, or even at the mastering level. But when it comes to the individual drum sounds, if they already look big and full and you don't like them, find different sounds. I promise it's so much easier than trying to polish a turd. Also, if you're still having trouble understanding compression, or more importantly, hearing it, try turning the volume down. It took me a long time to realize that the louder I was listening to something, the much harder it was to hear what the compression was actually doing. Number 1, mastering is there to fix your mistakes. So I taught for Guitar Center, and I have online students, and a lot of the time students will come to me and say things like, my mix, it's not mastered, so it doesn't sound good yet. Well, the reality is, if your mix doesn't sound good, your master's not gonna sound good. In my experience, mastering has more often than not amplified my mistakes instead of covering them up. Now, a good mastering engineer will do what they can, but they can't play God. If they have bad material to work with, the outcome is not going to be that much better. It's just going to be louder. So if you want a loud and clean master, you need a loud and clean mix. If you're all about loud masters, look into clipping, parallel compression, parallel saturation, doing it at the group level. These are ways you can achieve volume without ever actually pushing your song into a limiter. Also, I've had students think that width comes from the mastering stage, where width should really be something you do in the mixing stage. If you want width in your mix, you should be using things like stereo wideners, Haas effect plugins, or most basically just panning things to the left and the right. Don't be afraid to pan things. Just slapping a widener on your master channel is going to make everything wide, whether you want it to be or not. Now, I want to reiterate that these 5 pieces of advice are not bad in and of themselves. The reality is, if you hand a toddler a knife, they're probably going to cut themselves. It's the same with giving an inexperienced mix engineer a million plugins and expecting them not to play with all of them. It's like in the wise words of Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park. We were so obsessed with whether or not we could that we never stopped to think if we should, or whatever he said anyway. So subscribe to my channel and I'll see you later.